Periclou, which, as you all know, of course, is Maltese. Achtung, Achtung. Actually, James H. got in touch from Malta to tell this. Thanks to James. Well, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. I hope you enjoyed all the extra content we posted after the Chalk Valley History Festival.
Yeah, and it was great to see so many of you at the live recording of the podcast. In fact, we're going to do a whole new live show at the Edinburgh Festival, if you fancy coming along. Wednesday, August the 7th. There'll be giant maps, Nazi greatcoats. Al will recreate the parachute drop into Arnhem.
Hold on.
Not to be missed.
I didn't agree
You didn't know
to
that bit, did you?
Right, the show's at 1:45 in the afternoon. That's 1:45 in the old money. It's £14 a ticket, £12 for concessions. And you can either book tickets by going to assemblyfestival.com. It's assemblyfestival, all as one word, .com, or by calling the box office on 0161 623 3030. I have to say, having gone to Chalk Valley, to your festival, James, I'm quite interested in you coming to the festival that I'm really familiar with, at the Fringe. And
yeah, I haven't been up to Edinburgh for literally years and years and years, so I'm looking forward to it, I must say.
Brilliant, excellent. Right, okay, we're going to start with any other business, if that's okay. Before we get started proper, a lot of correspondence from the podcast First Army Twitter division. We said that Colditz prisoner and Conservative MP Erin Eve was killed by the IRA. In fact, he was killed by the Irish National Liberation Army. Thanks to Dave M for spotting that. Apologies, that's a bit People's Front of Judea, but there we go. Also, on the subject of Colditz, we mentioned a board game that was popular in the 70s and 80s. Well, guess what? Ian Wayhill contacted us to say it's been re-released as Escape from Colditz Castle World War II. That's interesting, isn't it? They've had to change the title to explain it. In the 70s, everyone knew exactly what Colditz was. Now you need to be told.
So you're going to be getting an edition of that, Al? You think?
Well, I might do.
Play it, give it a go.
I might do, get the action
but
man out.
But I don't know. I mean, I just wonder whether it's completely rubbish now or not.
It probably is, and you know, I think computer games have probably urinated on the chips of board games by now, haven't they?
Yeah, probably.
I mean,
actually, I've got a Nazi board game.
Maybe we should do a special edition where we play it.
Well, maybe we should. And I've got a Nazi board game which I've never played, and it's in really mint condition.
Of course you have.
Of course I have. Which was sold to me by Rob Schaefer. It was just so irresistible. Right. I just had to have it. And
what do you have to do?
I don't know, but it's got lots of sort of different bits in it, and basically conquer the world, obviously. But
right, okay.
But yeah, I've never sort of got down to the nitty-gritty, but apparently it was incredibly popular in the era of the Third Reich.
Well, that's a surprise, isn't it?
Anyway, recently we offered some book recommendations for the summer, and it seems to stir quite a lot of conversation. We mentioned Farley Mowat's And No Bird Sang, which prompted Alex Black to send us a picture of his first edition, bought the day after its wedding. So thank you for sending that in, Alex.
Yep.
Mark, who has the splendid Twitter handle @Spitfire1418, that doesn't work, does it?
No!
Anyway, doesn't matter, who cares?
I was trying to think, were there any Spitfires around 3 years after Agincourt?
Yeah. Anyway, he pointed out that all our book recommendations were from an Allied point of view. Anything you would recommend from the German perspective, he asks. Well, yeah, I suppose. The trouble is all the German memoirs I've read, they're very wordy, they're very earnest. They're just not great literature. I mean, there's obviously this Guy Sayers book, isn't there, Forgotten Soldier?
Yes,
that's a novel, strictly speaking.
Yeah, which is sort of which is worth a read, but it's kind of sort of fantastical, some of it, isn't it? And you don't really you because it's been queried a lot, hasn't it? Because he's an Alsatian German, isn't he? He's French German or German
That's
French,
right.
from your point of view. Joins up as an enthusiastic Nazi, and I remember the book ends with him getting home and them going, "Well, don't worry, French, don't worry about any of that." And you think, "Oh, right, is it that? Is it that simple?"
I made it all up as well.
Yeah,
and then there's Iron Coffins, which is a really good book about being in U-boats. But when I was I was researching War in the West 1. And I was looking into that, and it just doesn't tally at all. It's right. Really, you cannot make. I
mean, the classic.
You cannot make the facts fit the story.
The story, but the classic is the Hans von Luck account, isn't it? Which
again, it's not great literature. It's just a colourful memoir.
Yeah, and a lot of it, you sort of think, were you really at the centre of all these incredible events? Are you sure? And he's a sort of character. He comes across as this sort of swashbuckling, good German. The Desert War was an honourable war character.
Yeah,
and you wonder, how much.
And you realise the futility of the Eastern Campaign.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Well,
but he knew Peter Caddick Adams, who we had on a little while ago. He knew Hans von Luck quite well in the sort of late 70s and 80s.
Right.
And he said that Hans von Luck was so suave and urbane and very cool individual and could drink literally anyone under the table, no problem at all. Loved the ladies, and just a sort of bit of a sort of ex-German Julio.
I bet he was brilliant at that board game.
Yeah, he'd be fantastic. There's one other as well, is the Heinz Knocker Diary, I Flew for the Führer. And I've got to say that would have been very, very close to my list. I've got to say that's a really amazing book. But there's just not that many really good bits of literature, I think, that are written by the Germans.
Yeah.
I mean, God, Higher Hermans. Have you ever come across that?
Yeah, no.
Oh, don't bother. I mean, it's really, really hard work. That's a boring book. Although he did amazing things, which is kind of what makes you think, how can you make what you did sound so boring when it was amazing? I mean, this is a guy who kind of blew up Piraeus and stuff and set up the Wildersau. And anyway, we digress.
Yeah. James got in touch, someone called James. He got in touch to recommend Flashman author's Quartered Safe Out Here. George MacDonald Fraser's Quartered Safe Out Here.
Yeah, which is amazing.
That is an incredible book, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, and again, God, I mean, there's so many you could put on there. But Quarter Safe Out Here is one of the really, truly great. In fact, actually, I'm a bit embarrassed we didn't put that on because that is really, really brilliant. I love that book. It's just utterly fantastic.
And it starts with that really amazing thing about when the atom bombs dropped and him going, that Japanese guy who wouldn't come out of his foxhole wasn't ready to surrender. Wasn't defeated, didn't think the war was over, as he tried to kill me and my mates. And so we were all delighted when it happened. And to actually read that, read in sort of in tooth and claw as it was, is really, I think, really arresting now from our perspective. It's a fascinating book.
Yep. And G.W. wrote to point out the extraordinary biography of Zeno, the anonymous author of The Cauldron. He actually wrote the Arnhem-based novel while in Wormwood Scrubs, serving a life sentence for murder. Worth a little internet investigation on that one, maybe. You know a little bit about this guy, don't you?
Yeah. He was Pathfinder Squadron. I mean, basically, it's one of these thin novelizations. You know, it's basically what happened to him. And yes, he wasn't a good man by any stretch of the imagination. Right, now you may, listeners, you may remember James describing the extraordinary smoke-in cobras. I think it's smoking with a G, but actually it's smoke-in cobras, if you're going to get this right.
The smoke-in with an apostrophe.
Smoke-in with an apostrophe. It's like, Nick Fury in the Howling Commandos. Smoke-in cobras, an army of Brazilians, Brazilian people, by the way, you smutty lot, who fought in Italy in exchange for the Americans, building them as steelworks back home. Well, Mark Gill's got in touch to say, my father-in-law remembers the parade they had upon their return in Avenida San João, a central street in the middle, I hope I got that right, in the middle of Sao Paulo. He was a Cub Scout along with many other groups attending that day. He says now, though, most Brazilians don't even know they took part in World War II.
Well, we've got to change that.
With this podcast, set that as
we will conquer Brazil.
Windmill to tilt at. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, now prepare yourselves and cover the ears of the young. Put your lunch to one side. This next correspondence is extraordinary, if a little disgusting. I talked about Monty's autograph book recently, and we put some pictures up. We had a lovely response to that, and this prompted Mr. Hyde to get in touch. Whether he's writing in on behalf of Mr. Jekyll, we don't know. My granddad told me of a friend who was a rating on HMS Faulkner, the destroyer that took Monty to Normandy. This chap stole one of Monty's craps out of the heads, dried it, varnished it, and kept it as a souvenir. Different to an autograph, I guess.
Wow. What do you say about that?
We're not at that level of merch yet, are we, James?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there are limits. I got my brick from the Berghoff, and that's as far as I'm going. Yeah, I'm not that kind of brick either.
We're not going to do a hashtag to win a We Have Ways turd. Thanks to everyone who got in touch. Remember to use the hashtag We Have Ways on Twitter. Now then, how about this? 50 years ago, they put a man on the moon, but we've gone one better. We Have Ways of Making You Talk today takes one bold step for podcast kind. I'm at Battle HQ here in Chiswick, but James, get this. James, and he's got his Nazi board game out in front of him, I'm sure. James is at the Eagle's Nest, Berchtesgaden high in the Bavarian mountains. Once it was the exclusive preserve of high-ranking Nazis, the sort of Hollywood Hills of National Socialism, but it's relaxed its membership policy, and they've let James in. James, what's it like? Tell us.
It is the most stunningly beautiful place. And in fact, actually, I'm not at the Eagle's Nest, which is actually properly known as the Kelstein House, and that is towering above me. I can't quite see it right now, but when I was having my breakfast this morning, I could. I'm gazing at the Untersberg Mountains. So the Kelstein House was built for Hitler for his 50th birthday in April 1939 by Martin Bormann. And
I got taken to the pub
acolytes.
for my 50th birthday.
Yeah, well, what can you do? Anyway, the amazing thing is they had to get there, to get to this high, which is sort of on a sort of outcrop below the Hofer Gull, which is this sort of big mountain here. And to get there, they had to create what was then the highest road in Europe to do it. And then they couldn't quite get to the last bit, so they then had to dig a tunnel kind of 120 yards into the mountain and then create an elevator shaft 100 metres deep. Anyway, they finally took Hitler up there. He looked around and said, "I don't much care for heights," and came back down again, and only ever went up there another couple of times. But Eva Braun loved it. And Fegelein, who married, who was an SS officer who was murdered by the Nazis in the last days of the war in Berlin. He married Eva Braun's sister and had his wedding reception up there, and there's sort of pictures there and stuff. It is the most amazing thing. But down below on the actual Obersalzberg, which overlooks Berchtesgaden, that was sort of Nazis on the hill really. And Hitler first came here in, I think it was 1923. He was friends with this guy called Dietrich Eckart, and Eckart was this sort of free thinker, boozer, sort of libertine, but right wing libertine, and Hitler sort of became slightly enthralled to him, and Eckart took him to this part and said, "Look, this is the most amazing part. Here you can really think about things. You can work out some really bad ideology." And Hitler went, "Yeah, I absolutely get it, and let's go for big hikes." And then after he was released from Landsberg prison, he kind of continued writing the second part of Mein Kampf, and he had the Kampfhausel, which was this, it was impoverished, and he had this little wooden hut in the hills, which the remains of which you can still see. And every morning he used to sort of walk around to this. To this sort of mountain inn right beneath the Hofer Gull, where the Eagle's Nest now is, and he'd have hot chocolate and a thing called Windbeutel, which is a sort of incredibly rich pastry with ice cream and berries and stuff like that. And actually, obviously, because I'm here and I brought my family here on family, that's exactly what we did yesterday. I took them to the very same place, and you've still got the requisition notice from Martin Bormann on the wall because it's owned by the same family, and you can still have Windbeutel just like Adolf used to like it. It's amazing.
Because it was a sort of strip, wasn't it, of all the Nazi brass had houses going down the hill or up the hill, depending on, and the more important you were, the closer you were to the top. And
exactly.
And
so Hitler bought a thing called Haus Wachenfeld, and he rented it to start off with, and then Mein Kampf was so successful once he became successful politically that from the proceeds, from the royalties, he then bought it and converted it into the Berghof. And what's really interesting is Goering bought the house above him on a knoll, which is where this hotel I'm staying in is built. So while I was having breakfast this morning, was actually the actual patio bit where the breakfast was on the exact spot where the Goering house was. And then Martin Bormann, because he couldn't bear Goering, they all hated each other's guts like crazy, he then bought the house and created a house between Goering and the Berghof. And then Speer had a house a little bit further down, and there were huge sort of SS barracks and stuff. And now it's a bus park so that you can go to the Kelstein house. And there was the Platterhof, which was the sort of hotel for people. People, if you were sort of visiting and you were kind of quite high powered, this is where you'd stay, in the Platterhof. Most of that's gone, but a little bit late, and it's now turned into a sort of documentation centre for kind of.
Because obviously they had to knock it down because they don't. It's got to. It can't be a shrine or any of that stuff. So
but it is a shrine. I've been there in April, and there were lots of candles there because, of course, that's the anniversary of Hitler's birthday. I mean, it's really disturbing. And you can go around, you can find lots and lots of bits of the camouflage netting that were all over his house at the end of the war. That's just everywhere you go. There's bricks and bits of stuff, and you can find a bit of the kind of sort of the outdoor veranda patio bit, where they had all the colour photograph of him with Eva Braun and Blondie the Alsatian and stuff. Those really infamous photographs and film footage. You can still see that bit. I mean, it is absolutely still the remains of a house. I mean, so they haven't destroyed it.
Completely,
sort of trees grow up through it and all the rest of
Yeah.
it. But it's sort of macabre and kind of compelling at the same time. It's a really weird place. Anyway,
Well,
my family aren't
it
slightly
sounds like having a great break.
of that at all. I keep going, we've got to go and see the Hitler House at some point. And they sort of go, yeah, I'll just have another cup of coffee, please. Get out another glass of wine. It's very funny.
Excellent.
Oh, how they humour me. But you've been investigating the Maquis, haven't you?
Well, I've been in the Haute-Garonne in the south of France, which is sort of staying in a little country place, sort of 45 minutes north of the Pyrenees. So I've had a fun week of basically drinking too much wine and trying to finish a book that I'm reading about the end of the war, because I've just read that Promise Me You'll Shoot Yourself, which ties into a lot of what we're talking about.
How good is that book?
It's an amazing book.
It's really disturbing, isn't it?
Yeah, and then I'm reading Kershaw's book called The End, which ties in with this, the same, which is the more political aspect rather than the sort of personal aspect. Anyway, so I've been reading those books. But the thing is this part of France, because it's near the Pyrenees, there's loads of Maquis stuff. And not this trip, but the last time I went, we went and looked at the crash site of a Halifax in a place called the Pic de Douly, which is in the Pyrenees, which was from 624 Special Duty Squadron,
right,
aka the Black Squadron, who were based in North Africa and would fly supply runs and stuff and do that kind of black ops stuff into the south of France. And this is a Halifax that was dropping weapons for the Maquis Nistos Esperos in the south of France, and they crashed in the mountain. And I think, and I might be wrong, certainly locally they say that it's the highest British war grave in Europe.
Is that so?
And there's a plaque, and in the 80s they put a plaque, and they've since in recent years they've since sort of revisited the site and everything. So it's one of these things where the plane crashes, and then the Maquis have to go find the plane.
Yeah. Before the authorities can.
Before the authorities do, and they bury the men in the weapons containers, and they get their ID and their jewellery and all that sort of thing, and then have to hide the fact they know, and go up into the mountain and do a secret mountain trek to find the wreck. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
Yeah.
And they don't really know why the plane crashed. It fogged over or something. It was foggy the next day when the Maquis went up into the hills to find it. But you can go there. You drive this little windy road, and stop halfway up one of these, enormous Pyrenean mountains. And the place I've been staying, the Pyrenees are sort of, you look over one of the hills and you can see them looming, and they are massive, massive mountains, which of course, the Tour de France is going through had just gone through, and I went to see a friend of mine who works on the tour coverage, and we drove up into the mountains, and you're really struck by, for the cyclists, how brutal that is, that they're racing. But if you're trekking up there and then bringing equipment back and bringing, all this sort of thing, a very, very tough landscape is the impression you get. So there's this little place with this grave, and there is wreckage strewn all over it, and they've sort of gathered some of it together. But there's still, ammunition.
You can still
casing.
see bits, can you?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Wow.
It's really amazing, and there isn't a Commonwealth War grave there. It's a thing they've done the locals have done themselves, and like I say, they sort of revisited it and tidied the site up a few years ago. And I went 3-4 years ago. So you park up on the mountainside and then walk sort of 50 minutes up into the woods, into the greenery, and then there it is, this little clearing.
How amazing!
Where the plane, sort of epicenter of where the plane crashed. And the thing is because up the road on the 6th and 7th of July, there's a place called Milan where 100 Maquis gathered in 2 farmhouses and then were betrayed or rumbled one way or another and surrounded by the local Wehrmacht and shelled to destruction. 76 people killed there.
Wow.
And the farmhouse is this sort of it's like a mini ordure. So you've got rusted out vehicles. that were destroyed at the time, and then this.
Oh God, I'd love to see that.
Yeah, and this we'll put the photos up later because I've got them somewhere on my hard drive, and and there's this this relief that someone did, sculpture relief of the Maquis in their berets, and one of them's got what symbolically his Sten gun is out of ammunition, but he's fighting on anyway, and all this sort of stuff. And I think they held on for like a day and a night, and then in the morning were overwhelmed. And there's the hillside from where the Germans were shelling the farmhouse that you can go, and there's a viewpoint there. And then you go over the road and you go up the hill, and it's these shelled out buildings and this rusted stuff. And it's because they did a big weapons drop around that time as well. These same kind of squadrons for the local Maquis, and there was this constant game of cat and mouse and then being rumbled. So it's this, and everywhere you go, we drove up to a place called Longuevier, which where the tour was going.
Right.
And there's a lake up there and all sort of thing. But every now and again you see this thing that says, here some Maquis were murdered. Right. Little plaques, little signs, because that's where they were getting pilots out and people out over the Pyrenees. And there's a story about some guys coming back down and they were caught by the Germans and shot and killed there and then. So there's this ever-present backdrop of Maquis stuff, German reprisal. Allied attempts to sort of help, and organised out of North Africa, which just shows again, it's the thing we've talked about a lot, the deep pockets that the Allied had.
The deep reach as well. I mean, I suppose
huge
you have exactly
reach.
you find exactly the same things in Italy. All over northern Italy, there's little signs to kind of to partisans that were killed and stuff. And so actually just this week I was sent a memoir by a guy called Yarda Mizrachi, who I interviewed maybe 15 years ago, who'd been in one of the Garibaldi brigades around Ravenna, and he's still part of the AMPI, which is the kind of sort of partisan movement, but these little memorials are all over Italy, and I think it just reminds you, doesn't it, that the reach of the war and we still think of it in terms of sort of traditional battles, the Allies landing on Normandy or in North Africa or wherever it might be. But actually there's all these other bits of violence going on. And of course, a lot of the betrayals, and I wouldn't mind putting good money on the fact that actually the people that betrayed these guys were not Germans, but other French people. They'll be milice, there were more milice for much of the time than there were French resistors. And it's civil war going on. And it's the same with in Italy, and of course Yugoslavia, which was an absolute mess as well. Yeah, all these countries, there was little civil wars going on at the same time as this bigger, more kind of traditional war was going on, and it does sort of remind you that. And there's something about being at these places, isn't there? It's just incredibly kind of emotive. I mean, when I'm here, obviously Rachel and the kids are not in the slightest bit interested in the fact that this is Nazis on the hill. But when I am having my sort of egg and bacon, I am sitting there thinking, Jesus, I am looking at the same view that Goering was looking at, and I just can't help but feel kind of profoundly moved by that. It is really, really interesting, and it just underlines that if you have a passion for something, if you have a passion for history and for a particular period, visiting the ground on where these events took place is really, really rewarding.
But by the same token, going up that mountainside where those boys died,
in
the middle of the night, in what you could call a sideshow, or a sideshow on a sideshow,
but it's still alive, isn't it?
Exactly, and it's their lives lost, and they won't. They probably flew into the side of the mountain in the dark. They didn't even know it happened to them, and the sort of, and I think it was a Commonwealth crew, so people from all over the world, and that you've got this, incredibly personal thing that scales up to the size of the war and then back down to
the micro to the macro.
And then the Maquis risking their lives to go check the wreckage. The whole thing, it's fascinating. Anyway, I think it was
full of human drama. Do you know what? I'd absolutely love one day in my life, or at one point in my life, to do that trek across the Pyrenees. Yeah, to do the old resistance trail.
Well, when you've done it, you can come cool your feet in the pool.
In your pool.
Having put in, No, that will probably never happen at the rate we're going. Anyway, we need to take a short break while James reenacts the cable car scene from Where Eagles Dare. Don't jump till you're over the water, James. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. James has dried off nicely in the Bavarian sunshine, which means it's time for your questions, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, now this actually, I wanted to ask this. This has been bothering me. Hello, gents. Question from Junior Flinty, age 6, who went on holiday in Spain. He's clearly sick of having to have suntan lotion put on every 3 hours by his mum. But the question is, from Dave Hood or Flinty, did the troops in North Africa have to put on sunscreen or just put up and shut up? This is a thing that, because you're always seeing pictures of guys stripped to the waist in North Africa, you know, and elsewhere, you know, in hot climes. Did people wear sunblock?
The answer is no. I don't think they did. They didn't have sunblock. They were told it was verboten to kind of take your shirt off. Although people did, you weren't supposed to do that because actually getting sunburned was
helping the enemy.
Helping the enemy, yeah. So you weren't. So you just had to kind of be really, really careful and just kind of watch it. And you know, people used to wear their sleeves down and all sorts of stuff during the day and. You know, and yet they issued them as shorts, but they did have very long socks. So the only bit that was going to get really badly sunburned were their knees, and presumably they did, and your face and stuff. But I mean, if you look at pictures of them, even black and white photos of guys in the 8th Army, you look at them, you just know they're absolutely suntanned beyond belief.
Yeah.
And, you know, and obviously the darker you get, the kind of more you're able to resist, you know, and you don't get burnt. It's kind of when you first go out there and you're all sort of white and pasty and fresh from northeast England that you suffer a little bit.
But they also had a very different attitude to hydration as well, didn't they? Because that's the other thing we're told to do in the sun now, isn't it? Is make sure you go on the tube. If you've got a bottle of water on you when you're getting on the tube, you think, I'm only going 2 stops, thanks. But what did they do? Because I remember now. Forgive me for using this as a historical source, but I remember from my childhood an episode of It Ain't Half Hot, Mum, where they were all given salt tablets because they were worried about people losing salt through sweat, and that salt was. And I remember my dad watching that with my dad and going, "Oh yeah, God, this," because he served in Egypt at one point.
Right.
That for hydration, it wasn't what we do now, where basically you drink gallons of water if it's hot. They would be given salt tablets.
It's amazing, isn't it?
And not lots of fresh water, not lots of water to drink. I mean, it's kind of people were made of something else, weren't they? They were like
they really
wirier, and they weren't hench like nowadays.
Just tougher, maybe. I mean, I remember talking to Carol Mather, who was actually a bloke. He was probably being called Carol, and he, I suppose, like Carol Reed, isn't it? But the film director. But anyway, so Carol Mather was in the SAS, and was and he was talking very openly about. Doing those long-range, deep penetration missions with the SAS. They'd set off from Cairo, they'd go down to the kind of Gulf Kabir and, the Cave of Swimmers and stuff. And then they'd, so they'd set up a base, and then they'd do quite a long trek before they kind of went and blew up an airfield, a German air ground or whatever.
Yeah.
And I said, well, what do you do for water? He said, well, water was a problem because, we were always short of it, and we had to have water, take with us and stuff, and it was all a bit disgusting. But he said, I found that basically what I do is I sort of drink in the morning and, drink at night, and I just try very hard not to drink during the day much. And I said, but didn't you get dehydrated? And he said, no, not really, no, it's fine. And of course, and then they'd have sort of, the radiators in their Jeeps would run out, so they'd all piss in them.
Yeah, they'd piss in the radiator, yeah.
I mean,
I
know, it just didn't seem a problem. I mean,
Well, but maybe it was because they were all mad bastards. That
maybe it was, but also dry heat, I suppose. But the bottom line, back to sunblock. No, they just didn't get given sunblock at all. They did have sunglasses, where they were given sunglasses, and actually,
really?
the famous the sun visor that Rommel always used to wear on his peak cap was actually captured off a British officer. I think they were captured off. O'Connor or Neve, I think it was.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and a classic trophy like Monty then using the caravans.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So I think they just, I think it was very much put up and shut up.
So no Factor 50 in 8th Army.
No, and one of the things is that what they also used to do was they used to clean their clothes with petrol. So what you do is, because there wasn't enough water for cleaning, and you didn't want to get too scuzzy, So they'd just soak their shorts or their shirt or whatever with petrol, lie it out in the sun, and then it'd be good to go and look nice and sort of bleached and weathered as well. So that's how they'd wash. But I mean, the conditions of living in the desert. I mean, everyone I spoke to a lot of people who were sort of 8th Army veterans and things, and they used to say, look, you had to kind of embrace it, or it was another enemy, and you'd never win. So you just had to come to terms with it and accept that it was, part and parcel of your kind of daily existence. And
very cold at night. Very cold at night as well.
So it could be very cold at night. Yeah,
very cold at night. So you've got that weird contrast of the scorching hot days and the cold nights. Flies. I mean, all the accounts I've ever read about
millions
flies.
And millions and millions.
It's just flies absolutely everywhere.
Yep.
Especially on battlefields, and then keeping the flies away from getting into your food and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, and apparently that was one of the massive perks of being in the Long Range Desert Group or the SAS, is you just didn't have that problem.
Yeah.
So quite dangerous, but
no flies on them, right? Okay. Now, Mark Schofield says, who were the most highly trained, toughest unit of World War II? And this is excluding the team sent in Where Eagles Dare. Who would you say that were the tough, highly? Because we've just talked about the Long Range Desert Group. The SAS have come up. I mean, I kind of think when we're talking about these, they sort of don't count, because it's you can get 50 blokes and make them in hard as nails easily, right? Can't you? You section them off. You make it exclusive. You pick the people you want, so you're not wasting time with just regular Joes. I always think, because obviously that would, you could say, well, it's obviously the SAS or it's the LRDG or it's some. I think it's the things on divisional level where you've got to mobilise and motivate a lot of people. Because I always think, 101st Airborne Division always come up in these kind of like best ever, certainly on the Allied side, best ever units. And people are always very, very impressed at the way they fought at Normandy and then again Eindhoven.
Yeah,
the way they kept things going and the way how well mobilised they were and how well motivated and mission command, if you want, Ausflug Taktik or whatever. I mean, I'd put them forward myself, 101st Airborne, because I just sort of think. I always think I often think in these, if you're going to talk in this way, this kind of superlative way, that the really small specialist units are kind of a red herring.
Yeah, and I think also the other thing about units is it's more individuals, isn't it? Very, very small groups that are very, very tough. I mean, you would have. I remember interviewing a guy extensively called Jupp Klein, who was in the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, 1st Parachute Division. Yeah, and he'd been on the Eastern Front, he'd been in Sicily, he'd been all through Monte Cassino when they arrived in late February 44, all through the Casino battles. When you spoke to him, he was just tough as old boots. He was just he's someone you absolutely 100% wanted on your side, because he'd been there, done it. He knew every trick in the book. He was clever. He was canny. He was tactically shrewd. He had a sixth sense, of danger coming. You come across these people occasionally who are just super tough. Then you look at the originals from the SAS. I mean, all those guys, they're just really hard. And what they have is they have a thing in common, which is they don't really get scared. They kind of quite like the whole thing. They're adrenaline junkies. Yeah. Those are the sort of people that would kind of sort of parachute, ski off the edge of a mountain with a parachute.
Yeah, there'd be people who'd be base jumping now, basically.
Yes, exactly. They're just tough as old nails. Again, they've all got that sixth sense. They've kind of really experienced. They're able to use their initiative. But kind of putting that, I mean, you look at the kind of the Special Raiding Squadron, as it briefly became known, and their attack on D-Day on Sicily on 10th of July 1943. They come off boats. It's exactly like Pont de Hoc, but without the fuss. And they just take out this massive Italian position, series of guns, just like that, and they have 1 dead and 2 wounded in 2 days of fighting, and they capture Syracuse. I mean, it is absolutely phenomenal. As a unit of 280 men, I reckon you could pit them against anyone in the world, and they give you a pretty hard fight. But of course, then there are other German units as well that are particularly tough. You're talking about the Dirlewanger units. I mean, they're just filthy mean and tough and horrible, and you wouldn't want to come up against them. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard to pinpoint one specific unit, but what you really want is a combination of people who are motivated, intelligent, astute, and able to use and capable of leadership and able and physically
capable of leading
tough,
themselves,
physically really hard. Who are able to sort of endure pain and hardship and sort of shrug it off. And those people do exist.
So if we were going to do like a World War II top trumps,
yeah.
I mean, obviously size of unit. I think 101st Airborne would still beat your crack unit of 200 because there's like thousands of them.
Yeah, there are. Well, yeah, there's like 10,000 of them.
Exactly.
But they've got lots of new recruits coming in all the time who probably wouldn't be that good.
Yeah, okay. All right. I'll let you have that. Right. Okay. Now, so
anyway.
Jimmy Gregory says, after a Twitter conversation on the same subject, which would you prefer to do? Land by landing craft on a heavily defended beach or swoop down into action in a fully laden glider? Thanks, Jimmy. Well, what would you say, James?
Well, I'd like to do neither, but I think on
yeah, neither's high on my list.
I think the glider probably. And it depends also, land by landing craft in the first wave on a defended beach, or kind of a couple of hours later when it's not quite so well defended. You have to assume it's well defended first.
Well, yes,
first wave.
Because if you first lift on D-Day in the middle of the night, or you second lift at 9 o'clock in the evening.
Yeah, I think I'd go for the former.
Yeah. I think it's glider, isn't it? I think we're going gliders.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not foolproof.
I mean, the thing is, although they're not foolproof, and of course it depends which landing we're talking about. Because if it's Sicily and you're in a Waco that the pilot doesn't know how to fly and he puts you in the ocean and it sinks.
And only 4 out of 144 actually make it to the drop zone.
Yeah, exactly.
Then on balance, probably I'll go for the landing craft.
Yeah.
Because against the heavily defended Italians, it's kind of less of a threat.
So Sicily, you're going landing craft, but D-Day you're going glider.
Yeah.
What about, so let's go to Holland then, and they're not simultaneous, but like or the lowlands. So a landing craft of the Walcheren assault or a glider at Arnhem.
God, there's really not much in it, is there?
No, there's not much. Well,
what about Anzio? Anzio, that was pretty okay. Anzio, I'd go for that.
Yeah, Anzio. The first, right. I mean, the glider. The
Guadalcanal, that was easy.
Yes, if you want.
Well, the landing bit.
I read a fascinating thing about oh God, which book was it? I can't remember. About how in the run up for D-Day, they get in someone from the Pacific is brought in,
right,
to talk about amphibious landing.
Yeah,
and he says, "Why are you using wooden landing craft? What the hell are you doing? Right? Are you nuts? Why would you use? Why not? Why are you not using metal boats?" Yeah. And they basically treated me as like the amiable Hick from the sideshow. And what could he possibly know about amphibious landings? And there was very little cross fertilization or whatever whatever the word would be.
Well, that's because the South Pacific is flipping miles away. It's the other side of the world.
Yeah, but it's fascinating that he turns up and says, wooden landing craft, are you crazy?
Yeah.
And they're like, shut up, what do you know?
Wow. And so he's just completely ignored. I don't. Yeah. I presume it's ease of manufacture, isn't it?
Yeah, well, probably, yeah. Or and deadlines and all that sort of thing, because there is a landing craft shortage in the run up to D-Day anyway, isn't there?
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay, Brian Williams, who I see a lot, actually pops up a lot on my Twitter feed. If you were selecting a team to go on a do or die mission against an impregnable Nazi base, who would you pick among your followers, and what would their special skills be? Of course, if it's a proper war movie, their special skill is also their flaw, like the blind forger in The Great Escape. Or the
yeah, I definitely want to be armed with MP40s with unending, never-ending magazines.
You'd want to go to Clint Eastwood's Quartermaster and pick up one of those magazines.
Definitely. Well, I would definitely want Paddy Mayne. I'd definitely want what's his name? Johnny Cooper.
Yeah. Peter Fleming?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, him. I definitely want George Jellicoe, who's just completely amazing and just never seems to... he just thought the whole war was just a total lark. I mean, it was sort of Boy Scouts with guns. And Americans, who would I want? Well, I probably would want Dick Winters, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, people like that.
You'd Jim Woolwork to fly the glider.
Yeah, you would. You definitely would. You want a bit of air support, so you want some pretty good pilots. Don Blakesley would be good.
So, or Gibson,
Gibson, or Leonard Cheshire. Leonard Cheshire.
Yeah.
Leonard Cheshire.
I mean, the thing is how many missions against impregnable Nazi bases were there? Because I mean, if you watch World War II, films,
they happened all the time.
They happened all the time.
But if you look at reality, they never happened. I mean, there was a plan to go and assassinate. There was a plan to go and assassinate Kesselring at Taormina in Sicily.
Yeah,
and they were going to send in a submarine, and they were going to use HMS Upholder because the captain David Wanklin had been he'd honeymooned there just before the war, so he knew it. So they were going to send in a sort of commander, and then there was the raid on Rommel, wasn't there? But all of these were cancelled. And then there was the one that guy Damien Lewis has just written a book about the mission to go and blow up von Veitinghoff, I think it was, in northern Italy, and that never happened either because it moved. I mean, you know, and also the position wasn't that impregnable anyway.
Yeah.
So you know, they sort of, but yeah, I mean,
it's Anthropoid, of course, but that's not an impregnable Nazi base, is it? That's knocking off
a really evil bastard. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because the Americans did a hit on Yamamoto, didn't they? Where they sent
they did. They killed him. Yeah,
they killed him. Where they sent
April
lightnings.
42.
Yeah, special
43 rather.
Yeah. The special lightnings, didn't they? They sent out
ultra decoded. They decoded it, and they knew it, and they knew he was flying, and they absolutely shot him down. And they found his body, and he was still absolutely perfectly sat upright in his seat.
Yeah, it's an amazing story.
It is an amazing story,
and. There was distaste within the American command, wasn't there, about doing it because it was like it was putting a hit on someone basically.
Yeah.
And then of course the pilots involved when they got back argued about who'd actually shot him down.
Yeah, I did it. No, you didn't. I did it.
No, you didn't. Yeah.
It was authorised by Bill Halsey.
It
is an amazing story. And in actual fact, I've got a. I'm doing this whole series of new Ladybird books. They're not ironic, though. They're supposed to be to be serious. And there's this amazing artist called Keith Burns who does all the artwork for it. And the penultimate page of my Pacific War 1941 to 1943 Ladybird book is a picture of Yamamoto getting assassinated. Although obviously his plane, you don't actually see him being assassinated. But I'll show you the picture because it's absolutely fantastic of these P-38s homing in on it.
Brilliant.
So
right. Now we have another question. Richard Quance, do you want to read this one out, James?
So this one comes from Richard Quance. Great pod, chaps. Thank you, Richard. As a Brit now living in Australia, it surprised me to learn that the Japanese bombing of Darwin, something my European-centred World War II knowledge had blinded me to. Do you think Japan was ever serious about invading Australia? Well, yes.
Well, yes and no.
Yes and no. What it wanted to separate the United States from Australia. That was the key whole thing, and that was why they were going down into the Solomon Islands and going on to sort of New Guinea. It was to kind of have this. The whole point about the Japanese effort was not that they would ever completely defeat United States. What they were realizing was that they were rapidly growing urban population that couldn't feed itself. It was running out of resources. Was thinking, well, we're roughly the same size of Britain, and look how Britain's done it. It's just gone around the world having this sort of huge empire, which it gets its resources from. Why can't we have that? And the reason is because Britain and America and the Dutch have already got it. So let's take it back off them. And the first plan is to go into China, which is just across the sea and has got endless resources. But they get bogged down and it doesn't work. And actually resistance from the Chinese is after sort of initial victories for the Japanese, it gets stiffer and stiffer and stiffer. And they kind of run out of steam and they're running out of supplies and they've got to find it elsewhere. So the plan is to try and do a lightning strike that will cripple the US Navy and knock it out of the war for a long enough period for the Japanese to then take all that territory, take the resources and be strong enough to resist whatever the Americans then throw at them. And eventually they have a kind of settled peace where they have a new kind of economic bloc and a Pacific bloc of which they're the kind of top dogs. That was the plan. The fatal flaw in the whole thing was Pearl Harbor. None of the three aircraft carrier, which the Japanese absolutely correctly identified as the new preeminent capital ship on the seas, were actually at Pearl Harbor. So they destroyed lots of battleships, which was, I guess a good thing if you're Japanese. But the really key targets were the battleships, and they failed to get those. So it still did give them a little bit of breathing space, and they kind of, and they rushed off and went into Hong Kong and Singapore and Malaya and Burma and, New Guinea and all the rest of it.
But even had they sunk those aircraft carriers, even if the aircraft carriers had been present, that wouldn't have knocked America out of the war. It just would have...
It wouldn't have knocked them out of the war, but it would have
taken them longer.
Yeah, but I don't think Midway would have happened if they knocked out those... Midway happened in June. The Coral Sea in May.
All happened a year later.
Yes, but if you think... Yeah, so Midway is 6 months after Pearl Harbor in June 1942. I don't think Midway would have happened at that point. And what that would have also meant is that then they probably wouldn't have been able to get... the Americans wouldn't have been able to get a foothold on Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, which is just off the kind of sort of north-eastern top of Australia. And New Guinea is very close to Darwin. And I think what would have happened is America probably wouldn't have been able to get onto Guadalcanal, the only place where you could have an airfield there, at that point, which would have meant the Japanese would have continued their construction of their airfield, completed it, and made it probably a pretty impregnable base. So I think everything would have been different. I think ultimately the Americans would still have prevailed, and the Allies, of course, because there were lots of sort of British and Australians involved as well. But I think it would have taken an awful lot longer.
But to come back to Australia, I mean, in Australia, and we still haven't talked about Jonathan Fennell's book, we will at some point. There's the really interesting thing about how Australian morale and involvement in the war fluctuates wildly between kind of ambivalence and then we're about to be invaded, so super self-defence.
Yeah.
And the Darwin bombing very much plays into the latter category, that Australia is threatened, because up to that there's this kind of abstract thing in Australia. It's a war happening generally in Europe, and then it starts in the Pacific, but it's a long way away. It doesn't involve them. The Americans don't really want the Australians involved militarily, and you get this sort of high watermarks where Australia looks like it's under threat, and so the war effort goes into sort of overdrive, and then it falls away when the threat recedes, which I think which is really interesting. So the Darwin bombing is a sort of catalytic moment in Australian politics for taking the war more seriously.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And then you've got Japanese subs in Sydney Harbour as well at one point, haven't you? And that causes a similar kind of panic, or not panic. I mean,
just outrage,
full blown reaction. But I don't think that they were. I mean, the Japanese were serious about invading Australia if they could have achieved it, but they knew they couldn't achieve it. They were.
Well,
I
think the point
was arm's length permanently.
But I think they could have. They might well have sort of gone on to Darwin and taken a chunk of it. I mean, the point, if it had been. So I think they have a pretty clear, thought through strategy, but that is kind of reinforced by opportunistic strategy. So the strategy is to take the Solomons and New Guinea and New Britain and create that kind of barrier, that link, that shipping link and flying link between Australia and Hawaii and the Pacific edge of the United States.
Yeah.
But if there are other things along the way that can further enhance that position, such as getting into northern Australia, I think they would have done. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Now, Andy Hogben asks, what did you make of the Nazi gold train rumours that were flying around a year or two back?
Not a lot. I mean, everyone's always looking for the kind of El Dorado of World War II, don't they? I mean, people have been sort of scouring lakes in Austria for ingots of Nazi gold. People have been looking for the amberum taken from St. Petersburg. And that's probably at the bottom of the Baltic. They've been looking for Spitfires in Burma, and it's just something that just fires people's imagination, isn't it? That sort of, it's the old-fashioned sort of treasure hunting, but that is all it is. But what is amazing is the gullibility and frankly, stupidity of people, that they're prepared to spend, millions of quid, or certainly hundreds of thousands of quid, in kind of researching stuff that has just zero chance of ever coming to anything. I mean, the Spitfire one in Burma was amazing, wasn't it? Because, huge expeditions were being mounted and all that. And as everyone pointed out, even if they were there, it's one of the wettest places in the entire planet. And despite being covered in grease and packed up and the rest of it, the idea that you would unearth, I mean, the wood wouldn't be there anyway. That would have just rotted.
Yeah,
there wouldn't be much left of the planes. The idea that you'd find them, they'd all be in perfect condition. You'd literally a couple of bolts and they'd be good to fly back to Blighty. I mean, it's just nonsense.
Well, also, but the idea that the RAF would have been burying Spitfires at that point in the war is what?
Why would you?
Why would you? It's totally harebrained. But
the effort. Does anyone understand the effort involved in getting a Spitfire to Burma? I mean, it's just absolutely enormous. It's quite interesting because I know Seb Cox a little bit, who I think you know as well. He's a colleague of Sebastian Ritchie. Well, he's the head of the Air Historical Branch. And back in, I think it was 1997, they'd heard these rumours and they were asked to evidence. And he said they couldn't find any proof at all that these 10 Spitfires, or whatever it was, this squadron of Spitfires had ever been sent to Burma. And they're saying it's not impossible that they were sent to Burma, but they said, to put this in some context, we know about every single plane that was sent to Southeast Asia Command. So for them to be there, they would have to be the exception to the rule, and they are the most expensive and valuable planes that we're sending over there. In other words, it's nonsense. And they were told that back in 1997, and yet, in 2011 or 2010 or whenever it was, David Cameron was going, I think it's marvellous that we're going to have a Spitfire squadron to come all the way back from Burma. I mean, what a knob.
And on that note, James, we need to let you go. There's a mountain top for you to scale.
Well, I am actually about to scale the peaks of the Kelstein House at Eagle's Nest. So Rachel, who's still got a slightly dicky knee, she's going to head up on the bus. But me and Ned and Daisy are going to walk it. Wonderful.
Right, well, that's all we've got time for. Thanks, James.
Yeah, no, lovely to chat as always, and thanks for listening, everyone. Cheerio. See you next time.
Yep. Don't forget, you can see us live at the Edinburgh Festival, 7th of August. Please do get in touch on Twitter using the hashtag WeHaveWays. Auf Wiedersehen.
Yep, Auf Wiedersehen to you.